rough topic I have so far is traversing the sexual and political landscape, and I'm going to be using sex positivity and sexual liberation movements, as well as Me Too and incels, as kind of jumping off points for thinking about some of Zupancic's ideas regarding sex and the inherent negativity of sex. So one of Zupancic's sort of main ideas is that although sex is all pervasive in media and society, we still don't seem to know exactly what it is. What I'm interested in exploring in this paper is how Zupancic's take on sex as something that we cannot pin down, as something we don't know fully what it is within psychoanalysis, how we might apply this to the social movements or phenomena like incels, Me Too, and sex positivity, to sort of gain a better understanding of these movements, how they came to be, perhaps why they're limited, and or why our discourse surrounding them is limited. And so I'd also like to sort of look at how Zupancic's statements about the impossibility of sex shed light on contemporary issues such as inceldom, Me Too, and sex positivity, or conversely, how these movements shed light on Zupancic's claims. This paper is going to be exploratory, so I don't really have a clear thesis yet, but I am hoping to develop connections as I conduct my research. So one of the sort of main ideas that I'm using from Zupancic as sort of a through line throughout thinking about these different ideas is sexuality as disruptive. So sexuality as being something that is inherently disturbing and destructive as opposed to constructive. Really thinking about Zupancic's idea of sex as the operator of the inhuman, as opposed to something that defines our humanity. I think this third quote here is important. Paradoxical as this might sound, one of the primary tasks of psychoanalysis is to slowly but thoroughly deactivate the path of dissatisfaction, to render it useless, to produce sex as absolutely and intrinsically meaningless, not as the ultimate horizon of all humanly produced meaning. And so what kind of all of these ideas point to is this idea that sex doesn't make us human, and it's not our issues with sex that prevent us from becoming whole subjects. Rather, sex is meaningless, disorienting, and is the operator of the inhuman. I think this basic concept is useful for thinking about sex positivity and sexual liberation. So another idea of Zupancic that I'm hoping to sort of use for this paper is this idea that structures contain the gap of the unconscious. And she talks a lot about this in a specific lecture that she gave with Zizek and Dolar. Talks about this idea that culture and society are not simply symbolic sources of repression conducted against real bodies, but they are themselves hounded by a real that bars them from within. And so it's not enough to say that culture, society, and power simply cause repression, but that they are themselves formations built of repression. And so she says, wherever there is controlling of sexuality, you can be sure that there is a massive problem of the structure that does it itself. So it's not just its power, but also its impotence. So she's essentially saying that within systems of power which attempt to control sexuality, the impossibility of the structures themselves is revealed, not just the way that those structures influence subjects within the systems. And so my thoughts on this are not fully fleshed out yet, but I think it's a really useful point for thinking about structures and discourses on sex and the way we talk about these discourses. In the reading we had in class, she sort of opens with this example from the film Freud, the Secret Passion, where Freud is describing his theory of infantile sexuality, and the audience members react unpleasantly, and there's a big uproar. Zupancic just kind of elaborates on this, saying it's very easy to attribute this violent reaction to the conservative Victorian morals of the time. And so we tend to think that compared to that, we have become very tolerant and are able to talk about sexuality openly, and we have this idea that we know that sexuality is nothing to be ashamed of and that it's good for our mental and physical health. But despite this, she says it might come as a big surprise that this is not the case. It's just sort of reiterating her idea that, or the psychoanalytic idea that sexuality is destructive rather than constructive. And I sort of want to use this to think about how contemporary conceptions, or even sort of early feminist conceptions about sex as liberating, promoting casual sex, polyamory as constitutive of a free, liberated subject. So the ways in which casual sex, polyamory are sort of the keys to making us liberated subjects. I kind of want to think about how the move towards sex positivity may just be a reaction to the knowledge that sex is destructive. So the move toward polyamory as a liberating alternative to the conservative, restrictive binds of monogamy, is this merely a reaction to the knowledge that sex is destructive? Yeah, so jumping off of sort of this discussion of sex positivity, I might bring in Bersani's Is the Rectum a Grave to sort of think about some of the arguments he's making in reaction to Dworkin and McKinnon's what he calls the redemptive reinvention of sex, and their call to abolish pornography, whereas he sort of calls for the opposite. We should increase the production of pornography, and sort of he argues that sex is anti-communal, anti-egalitarian, anti-nurturing, and anti-loving, and that the value of sexuality itself is to demean the seriousness of efforts to redeem it. And so we might interpret this view as sort of the opposite of the push to abolish sex and pornography, because he's sort of arguing we should lean into sex as anti-loving, anti-nurturing. Incels are sort of a useful example for thinking about some of Zupančič's ideas surrounding the negativity of sex. And so we might take incels as a reflection of the anxiety over knowing that we don't know about what sex actually is. So rather than confronting this unknowability, they make sex, or the absence of it, the root of their suffering, and sort of condemn themselves to this life of loneliness. When in reality, this condemnation is fairly rash and sort of allows them to avoid having to change their opinion of themselves or their worldviews so that they might be more appealing to women. And so I kind of think they reflect the way we construct meanings surrounding sex to process or justify not knowing. So there's obviously a number of difficulties with this proposal so far. There's a number of ways I could potentially organize or frame this paper. I could organize it as an exploration of why we have difficulty coming to concrete conclusions about sex, and thinking about this in relation to Dean's essay on why queer theory has trouble addressing sex, and then thinking about how discourses surrounding Me Too and sexual liberation and sex positivity also represent our difficulty in addressing sex in general. So trying to bring in all of these different things might be a little bit all over the place. I'm kind of hoping that the links between these topics will emerge as I begin to write, or I could also sort of separate the paper into categories or like subjects.